back in 2014, you led a world first sort of research team into restarting a heart that had stopped beating for 20 minutes and successfully transplanted that. Can you explain how that was possible and the process behind it?
Yeah, well, I mentioned I did a PhD in basic sciences in Melbourne, and I set up a similar basic research laboratory here in Sydney, and that became part of the Victor Chang Cardiac Research Institute, and it's now known as the Transplantation Research Laboratory. And one of the major themes of the lab has been to look at better ways of preserving hearts for donation, so that that we know that we can be confident that when we transplant this heart, it'll work. Now, I probably need to go back a step and explain now that there are really two pathways to deceased organ donation now. And the typical scenario and the more traditional scenarios where someone has sustained a catastrophic brain injury, maybe from an accident, a car accident, or maybe a stroke. They've survived to reach the hospital. They've made it, and then they've made it to the intensive care unit. They're connected to a ventilator to help their breathing. But it becomes apparent over a period of hours, sometimes days, that this person has lost all brain function, and that's happened permanently. And there are specific tests that can establish that. But in that scenario, the heart is still beating. The breathing is being maintained by a machine. But for the family of that person, they come in to see them at the bedside. It needs to be explained to them that this concept of brain death, that a person whose brain has died has actually died. And by and large, most people are very happy, accepting of that concept. Now, if they agree to organ donation, then the donor can undergo testing. So, like, you can do an echo scan to check the heart. You can even do a coronary angiogram. So you can do all these tests to check that the heart will work. And that at an agreed time, the donor is then taken to the operating theatre. All the organs, the body's opened up, and all the organs are removed. And for the heart, traditionally we put it in an ice bucket. We give a cold preservation solution, put in an ice bucket, and then transport it from the donor hospital back to the recipient hospital, and where we transplant it. Now, particularly from about the early 2000s, there's been an increasing utilisation of what's called the donation after circulatory death pathway. Now, in this scenario, again, there's usually been a catastrophic brain injury. Person survived to make it to hospital, but when the intensive care doctors undertake brain death testing, it's clear that there may be some residual brain function. There may be a reflex intact or something like that, but that person isn't dead. But it'll be clear to the intensive care specialist that this person has no prospect of recovery, of meaningful recovery. So the intensivist, under those circumstances, will explain the situation to the family and generally recommend withdrawal of life support, which means turning off the ventilator. Now, if the family agree to that, then there'll be a discussion about organ donation. And if they agree to that, then the organ retrieval teams will be notified. And at an agreed time, the donor, they will withdraw life support, which means turning off the ventilator, basically. And usually after that, the person will not breathe or will not breathe effectively. And over a period of time, as their breathing stops, their heart will stop. And then we now wait 5 minutes after everything stops, and then death is declared. And this is called donation after circulatory death. But in the period where between turning off the ventilator and the heart stopping, the heart's being subjected to this sort of lack of oxygen and all these stresses that are going on. It's a bit like having a global heart attack. And for a long time, it was thought that these hearts would not be recoverable. So in the early 2000s, we were recovering lungs and livers and kidneys from these donors, but no one was prepared to retrieve the heart. But we modeled this in our laboratory at the Victor Chang Cardiac Research Institute, and we were able to show that you could recover hearts from DCD donors by putting them on a machine, taking blood from the donor, warming that up, and then getting the heart beating on the machine. And you could tell by its performance on the machine whether it was going to work. And so we spent 5 or 6 years establishing this. And once we got to that point where we were sure it will work, we then started a clinical program. And as you mentioned, we did our first human DCD heart transplant in 2014. Now, I'm pleased to say that person is a delightful woman in her 60s now who's done extremely well. And as you mentioned, we were the first group in the world, or our group was the first in the world to use this type of approach to recover these hearts. No one had been prepared to do it up until then. You know, so far at least, it looks like the recovery of these hearts and the long-term outcome of people who received hearts from these donors looks to be the same as it is for people who receive hearts from the more traditional brain-dead donors. Now, in our own program, we've now done 69 of these so-called DCD heart transplants. Talking to colleagues around the world now, the numbers are up pretty close to 500 that have been done globally since we started. So this is a technique that's certainly taking off around the world. There are centres in the UK, Europe, and in North America now who are doing this and also reporting similarly good results.
It's nothing short of remarkable, Pete. And for someone who's spent time on the waiting list and wondering whether or not you're going to get one in time, you know, just one extra transplant can mean that, you know, the difference. So for that many around the world, and obviously that will increase with time, is an incredible thing to achieve. So congratulations.
Oh, thanks. No, well, you know, it's, as you say, I think it's a very nervous time for people who are on an active waiting list for a transplant. And, you know, we're in this unfortunate situation where there are many more people who would benefit from a transplant than there are, you know, suitable donors to meet that need. And the more transplants or the more hearts that we can recover from deceased donors, then, you know, the better we can close that gap. And I guess the other really positive thing to say, particularly in the last 20 years, has been the increase in Australia's deceased organ donation rate, which has gone from, you know, about 10 donors per million head of population now up to over 20 donors per million. And, you know, that's had a dramatic impact on the number of transplants being performed.
Yeah, and I remember that, Pete, because you know, when I was on the list, I obviously looked right into it, and the rates were really low. We were, you know, it's before the national body was appointed to look after it, and yeah, it was a shock for me to find that out, and it's a delight to see that we're so far up the list in donation rates per million per population. So, you know, with your help and everything else, hopefully that continues to climb. And I think Spain's still leading, aren't they?
Spain is the exemplar. They're now over 40 donors per million, and their sort of social demography is very similar to Australia's. They're very, it's not that they have more people die in car accidents or things like that. They're basically similar. It is all, you know, the biggest determinant of the deceased organ donation rate is the consent rate. How often the families of people who do donate organs, or how often people who die in circumstances where donation is possible consent to that. And all the improvement, all the increase we've seen has basically been a reflection of an increase in the consent rate. And clearly, it's the donor circumstances are invariably sudden, tragic, and unexpected. And it's very difficult, I think, for families to make these sort of decisions at the time when they have someone who's dead or dying, to be asked this sort of question without sort of any foreknowledge of what the donor's wishes would be. And that's why I think, campaigns to try and get people to talk about organ donation and just to make it clear what their wishes are really helps in that sort of difficult situation. And as I'm sure you're aware, there is very broad community support for organ donation. I think it's 85% or more of the Australian community support organ donation and transplantation.
And I remember back when I was researching it at a younger age, there was that 85% of people support it. But then when it comes to the question being asked in that difficult circumstance, it was much lower. Has that changed now? Because it seemed like that.
Yeah, I think the before the establishment of the Australian Organ and Tissue Authority, which happened in 2008, our consent rate was, I think, just below 50%. So, half the time people were asked, they would just say no, again, because of the stress that they're under. But I think the consent rate now, I'm not sure what the exact figure is, but I think it's up around about 60 to 65%. And that's what's led to this quite, doubling of the deceased organ donation rate. And if we got to where Spain is at sort of 85%, where we would probably double the number of deceased organ donors again. So a lot of it is about having experienced people conduct this conversation, this difficult, otherwise very difficult conversation with a very distressed family. And it's not about, trying to talk them into doing something that they would not otherwise do. It's about explaining to them the situation and how this is, as tragic as it is, the one potentially positive thing that might come out of this is that their loved one could save the lives of, up to 7 other people. Yeah,
exactly. And it is, for me, it's the ultimate gift you can give anyone. And I'm fortunate to be lucky enough to be on the beneficial end of a very successful heart transplant. And I obviously am forever thankful for the donor family and my donor for that decision.